In this video, we're going to look at the economic effects of a monopoly when we compare it to a perfect competition. And when we speak about economic effects, there's three main factors that we want to look at. First of all, we look at price, and then we look at quantity, and finally, we also consider efficiency. Right. So let's compare these things when a good is produced by a perfect competition and versus where it's produced by a monopoly. So we have two diagrams here to describe that and to show that. The first one will be a purely competitive industry, and in this purely competitive industry, you see that they produce where the supply, which is the marginal cost, is equal to demand, and they produce at a price that is equal to the marginal cost, and it's also equal to the minimum average total cost. So to understand this, obviously you'd have to understand what happens in a perfectly competitive market, but that's the fact there. And then when we look at a pure monopoly, you find that they produce where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, and that's the quantity they produce. Because of that, they infer the price from the demand curve, and they produce that price that were given by the demand curve, and the quantity will be QM in our case, and PM will be the price. So now if you look at these two, you find that with the price for a perfectly competitive market, this would be, if we actually take that just to figure 3 and we look at where a perfectly competitive market would produce this good, it would produce this good where the price is PC. All right, so that PC would be the price, and the quantity would be QC. So PC is the price, QC is the quantity. But the monopoly produces QM, and this QM is produced at a price of PM. So if we're thinking of the economic effects, comparing the monopolist to a perfectly competitive market, we can see that the monopolist, first of all, when we talk of price, the monopolist will produce this good at a high, or sell this good at a higher price. PM is higher than PC. Then now we think of quantity. The quantity the monopolist will sell at is the quantity the monopolist will be willing to produce is QM, and at a quantity the quantity of QM is less than the quantity of QC, which the perfectly competitive market would have produced. So it means that the monopolist has a higher price and a lower quantity compared to the competitive market. Now let's talk about efficiency. With a perfectly competitive market, they would be producing at this point QC. Sorry, not QC, point C. So at point C, you find that marginal cost is equal to price, and when marginal cost is equal to price, that means there is no inefficiency, there's no deadweight loss. Right? Now we can go on to look at where a where a pure monopoly would produce. The pure monopoly would first figure out the profit maximizing quantity, which is QM. They figure out where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and then they produce at point B on the demand curve, or they sell at point B on the demand curve, where the price will be PM, the quantity is QM. So because of that, you find that we end up with a deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is the red triangle there. That red triangle is a deadweight loss, sometimes called an efficiency loss. Remember, we talked about in previous chapters, you would have seen consumer surplus and producer surplus, and that part was supposed to, that red area, that red triangle was supposed to be producer surplus and consumer surplus. But now, because they're producing at point B, that area, that red area, goes to no one. It's neither producer surplus nor consumer surplus, so no one receives that red area, and that's a deadweight loss. So with regards to efficiency, you find that in a perfectly competitive market, there's no efficiency loss, but with a monopoly, there's an efficiency loss. And in our case, the size of that efficiency loss is the size of that area ABC, the triangle ABC. So there's an efficiency loss, a deadweight loss. And also something else happens, and this is regarding welfare. So because initially you find that the producer surplus, I'll just draw for you the producer surplus. The producer surplus was equal to this area. If we look at our purely competitive graph, this area represented the producer surplus, the green area there. Now, if we go to look at the monopoly, because the monopoly is producing at point B, the producer surplus has grown to this area now, that green area. So there's a bigger producer surplus. Producers are happier, obviously, or the monopoly, right? Since it's only one producer, they're happier. But now, if we look at the consumer surplus, initially consumer surplus was quite high as such. And now, if we sketch out the consumer surplus, you can see that it reduced by such a large amount. Okay. So because the consumer surplus is reduced, that's another economic effect we can talk about, that a pure monopoly would reduce the size of the consumer surplus and increase the size of the producer surplus. So another word that you might hear, a very popular word, would be like welfare losses. So welfare losses, we're talking about the quantity. You can see the quantity in a perfectly competitive market would have been high, and then now it's become lower, right? So there's a reduction in welfare there because less people get to consume that product. And in some cases, this is one of the things that you might want to talk about. And it's also shown in some cases, some people show it with regards to the price, that the price is also higher. And this is then overall gets reflected in the fact that there's a lower consumer surplus. Okay. So those are the economic effects, and that's what we talk about: price, output, efficiency, and that's the information we have regarding the economic effects when we compare a monopoly to a perfectly competitive market. All right. So in the next video, we'll talk about regulated monopolies. And if you'd like to see the notes and the information regarding the stuff that we've just discussed, there's a link in the description where you can get the slides, read through the slides, read through the notes to understand what exactly is going on. All right, thank you.